Thank you all for being here today at the very beginning of this new quarter here at the Korbel School. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion of Latin America's democratic decline and possibilities for resistance. I'm Kai Thaler. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the C Center for International Security and Diplomacy and an assistant professor of global studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. My personal focus in Latin America is on Nicaragua, on its revolutionary history, and its authoritarian present. Many thanks to the C Center and the Korbel Latin America Center for sponsoring this event, and to Kate Morgan for her organizational help. So New Year's Day, just over a week ago, saw Jair Bolsonaro sworn in as president of Brazil, and he immediately acted to consolidate power, curb the independence of NGOs, open up Amazonian lands to development despite indigenous objections, and give security forces a sense of free rein to continue behaving violently towards citizens. In Nicaragua, whose hundreds of political prisoners now outnumber the political prisoners in Venezuela, imprisoned activists were beaten for singing the Nicaraguan national anthem on New Year's Eve, as Daniel Ortega's government continues to strangle the media and civil society. Nicaraguans deported from the US after being denied asylum have disappeared on their return to their home country. Venezuela has a government considered illegitimate by almost all other countries in the region, and millions of Venezuelans have fled the country's economic collapse and authoritarian rot. Evo Morales is currently trying to win a fourth term as president of Bolivia. Guatemalan President Jimmy Morales has repeatedly tried to shut down a UN-backed anti-corruption commission, and this week announced its expulsion from the country. In El Salvador, presidential frontrunner Nayib Bukele has taken up the Trump and Bolsonaro mantle, claiming the election will be stolen from him through fraud, engaging in bellicose rhetoric, and attacking the media. Indigenous activists and indigenous rights are under attack in Argentina and Chile, while crime constricts daily life in much of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. While democracy is currently under threat around the globe, why has democracy been in retreat in Latin America at a time when, economically, the region has been better off than during the debt crisis of the 1990s, when democracy persevered? Meanwhile, countries that suffered political crises in the 1990s, Peru under Alberto Fujimori, and Ecuador's series of irregular governmental changes, these countries have pulled back from the authoritarian edge. Why have voters brought into power leaders like Jair Bolsonaro who are hostile to democracy? And what are the possibilities for actors within Latin America and for their allies abroad to resist the tide of authoritarianism and to strengthen and restore democracy throughout the Americas, including here in the US? Today, I'm happy to convene a group of distinguished scholars of Latin American politics and history to discuss these issues. And it's my hope that our conversation yields greater understanding both of the roots of Latin America's current democratic crisis and of the seeds for a more democratic future. Each panelist will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes. I'll give some brief summary remarks, and then we'll open up for a question and answer period. First, we have Rafael Lloris, who is an associate professor of Latin American history here at the University of Denver and a Latin America Center affiliate. He's the author of Transforming Brazil, A History of National Development in the Cold War Era, and journal articles on topics ranging from the history of 20th century development ideologies, the history of labor activism in Brazil, to Brazilian foreign policy at the turn of the 21st century. He's currently working on an edited volume on the expansion of economic frontiers in the Amazon region of Brazil and developing new research on the history of US-Brazilian relations. Rafael is also a frequent author of op-ed pieces in Brazilian publications on current political and cultural issues in Brazil, Latin America, and the US. Next, we'll have Andy Baker, professor of political science and director of the program on international development at the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. Andy studies Latin American politics, mass political behavior, and international political economy, and he's written 2 books, The Market and Masses in Latin America and Shaping the Developing World, the West, the South, and the Natural World. He's currently finishing a book manuscript on the influence of social networks on voting behavior in Latin America. And he's published many journal articles on electoral politics and political economy in the Americas, including a 2016 article on how the identity of the Workers' Party, or PT, in Brazil has changed over time. And he's also developed data sets on political ideology in Latin American elections. And last but not least, we're very pleased to have Consuelo Amat in from California, where she's a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University's Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, having recently received her PhD in political science with distinction from Yale University. Consuelo studies civil resistance to authoritarian governments and is currently working on a book manuscript on how resistance to dictatorships and repression emerges and is sustained, building on research on Chile and opposition to the Pinochet regime. She's also written and consulted on Venezuela and the possibilities for civil resistance and a stronger democracy there. So thank you all for being here again, and I will let Rafael take it away.
Sure. Could you pass the slides, or should I? Hold on. We'll pass here. Oh, fantastic. Open it up. Okay. Did you? Yeah. So to go forward, I just press there.
I think
Absolutely.
so, yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you very much, Kai. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always encouraging the interest in trying to understand such a challenging and important, relevant topic such as the ones we are covering today. My connection to the Corbell School and to the Latin American Center at Corbell School specifically has been always very fruitful, I hope, and also a pleasure. So thank you very much for all for being here, and the rest of the members of the conversation. So this is the gentleman that I'm going to mostly talk about today. If you haven't seen his face, that's his face and his sort of a famous gesture with guns, right? That's what became a distinctive political image that became known in Brazil for the last several months. He is now the president of Brazil, as Kai mentioned earlier, and the question I'm trying to reflect a little bit today, and I probably have too much, or have to go a little fast, is how we get here, right? How we make sense of this gentleman becoming president of Brazil, given what he represents. So I think for us to really understand that, we need to, for once, go over a little bit what was happening in Brazil in the last decade or so, when Lula was still president. Lula becomes president of Brazil in 2003 and served until January 2011, during a time when Brazil witnessed a remarkable economic growth, socioeconomic, political, cultural inclusion of to an unprecedented degree, while becoming more active globally, expanding connections to the new partners such as the other countries of the BRICS, such as the ones portrayed in that image, while not really threatening and being able to manage that with continued good relationship, even though somewhat redefined with the traditional partners such as the U.S. and European Union. So Brazil was moving in a very promising path, as was portrayed by the international media at the time. This was also a time when Brazil witnessed a significant degree of a reduction of poverty. Even withstanding the global recession that hit Brazil a little later than the recession of 2008, 2009, only coming to Brazil about 2012, 2013. So things were going really with promising winds at the time, right? Through counter-cyclical measures, enlarging the domestic market, and a lot of social programs, Brazil withstood the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, while not only growing the economy, but distributing wealth is a little of an overreach, but reducing absolute poverty, such as portrayed in that graph right there. This was such a successful experience that Lula was able to surprising elect his former chief of staff, Dilma Rousseff, president of Brazil, in the election of 2010. being the former chief of staff, she sought to continue many of the policies that Lula put together, even enlarging some of the social programs, such as the one portrayed in that to your right picture there, which was a housing social program, Minha Casa Minha Vida. She significantly enlarged that while also growing expenditures such as subsidies to business through sort of neo-developmentalist policies, and continue to sustain and to enlarge programs such as the famous program Bolsa Família, the monthly stipend paid to poor families that keep kids in school. So again, things seemed to be going on a good path, and that came to a halt, or start coming to a halt really by mid-2013, when hundreds of thousands of Brazilians start taking to the streets throughout Brazil, in most large cities in Brazil, in June 2013, in a still to be better understood phenomenon that started in a not very organized and concerted and sort of led by one single group of people, but in masses, Brazilians took to the streets, largely to question some of the expenditures related to the large mega sport events that Brazil was going to host, such as the World Cup of 2014 and the Olympic Games of 2016, and questioning some of those priorities and demanding, while cost of living had been significantly increased during those 2010, 2011, 2012, so questioning some of that, demanding sort of attention to the plight, especially in the big cities, of people in terms of urban transportation and the infrastructure inefficiencies, while spending billions of dollars, literally, to build stadiums to host those events. So initially, those protests were, as I said, not entirely organized or coalescing to one single leadership, and rapidly escalated and became really an From question of priorities of the government, it started voicing also opposition views to the government. And while Dilma, right, the president of Brazil, tried to respond to those demands, she was very sharply constrained in doing so by her own supporters in Congress, and especially by PMDB, one of the still one of the most influential parties in Brazil, which had the vice presidency of Michel Temer, who was the vice president, who was one strong voice against some of the reforms that she proposed, enhancing accountability and a political reform that she had voiced that she would send to Congress, and the PMDB said, don't even send to Congress because we're not even going to consider your bill. That's sort of one element that a lot of people sort of forget in this whole narrative of the escalation of the political crisis in Brazil, and I wanted to highlight that. From that on, things just got worse. Conservative forces started really using some of those protests, especially throughout 2014 and forward, 2015 and so forth, to really voice a strong opposition to Dilma. She nonetheless was able to win re-election, the October election of 2014. But as I said, from then on, conservative forces in the media, in business groups, in the traditional parties in Congress and throughout the country really sought to reverse much of the appeal of the Labour Party, PT, in Brazil, and really portraying this image that enough of PT, enough of the Labour Party, and we need to sort of come to an alternative proposition to this rule. This escalated rapidly when the vice candidate, the candidate of the opposition, this gentleman there on your left, Aécio Neves, refused to accept his defeat. He went to the federal courts, electoral courts, to demand that the election, to claim that the election was stolen from him. That didn't go anywhere, and then he started claiming in January 2015 and so forth, in February and March, demanding people to take to the streets to demand an impeachment to Dilma. That seemed like to be an absurd claim, and more absurdly, so that it started really working. People started taking to the streets, especially among middle-class groups in the large cities in the southeast and south of Brazil, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, among others, Belo Horizonte. And that's some of the images we have, people in the financial center of São Paulo, in the Paulista, drinking champagne to protest, right, as a political claim to say, we are the wealthy, we really are the owners of Brazil, and we are done with having Labour Party in Congress, and we are really staying here on the streets until Dilma steps down. The first they invented and suggested that she should resign, and then they start really pushing the different bills in Congress to impeach her. that's exactly the time, it's 2015, when a strong, a deep recession hit the Brazilian economy. The government was not able to address that situation. On the contrary, it made it worse by really tightening the belts of some of the stimulus that the government had been put in place for the several previous years. And then through a strong recession in the economy and through a really what should be called a legislative sabotage in Congress, not really approving any of the bills that the government tried to propose, and the continuation of this interesting marches, toasting champagne in the big, wealthy neighborhoods of the big cities in Brazil, the crisis really escalated to become a massive national political and economic crisis. This is also an interesting image that was displayed throughout this protest. As you can see, I don't know if you got that, but what it says is, "I want my country back now." The similarities are not coincidental, right? I want my country back. So they're really pushing for an end to the Labour Party administration that amounted to finally impeaching Dilma in June. From June to August, the impeachment proceedings, took place in Congress of 2016. And so Dilma was impeached, and the Vice President Temer takes over and becomes president of Brazil. He brought to power one of the most anti-popular, anti-labor, anti-social sort of cabinets in Brazilian history. And now Bolsonaro seems to be able to top that record. From that on, again, things become a much bigger political crisis, which I'll come back in a minute. I just think we also need to remember, to understand and make sense of this, not only the last decade, but also a little bit of a historical perspective. As a historian by trade, I need to throw a bit some ideas here that I hope we can pick up later in the conversation. So I'll basically propose some ideas, and I hope we will have and I know we're going to have an interesting conversation that I hope will be useful to that. What I'm saying is that we need to remember that Brazil has a very, very authoritarian political history. It is a country that has had a succession of governments that promoted modernization, but in a very top-down and restricted, the political, democratically restricted format. As one of the greatest Brazilian historians, Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, has proposed, democracy in Brazil has always been a bad misunderstanding. So out of 130 years of the Republican regime we have had in Brazil since 1889, we probably would be able to say that Brazil has lived for about 25 to 30 years of democracy within 130 years of Republican regime, and a full-fledged, what we would consider, liberal democracy. So while Brazil became, of course, and it went through a series of transformations throughout the 20th century, it was always very creatively designed by ruling groups, ways to restrict enfranchisement of Brazilians through literacy requirements, through restrictions on political parties, through indirect elections such as those that were held during the dictatorship from 68 to 85. And again, as Brazil modernized and became an important industrial base in Latin America and in the world, we can see that that was done usually through very restricted authoritarian regimes. Interestingly, regimes and leaders such as Vargas, the name Vargas, Getúlio Vargas is here on the left, and then President Médici, the dictator from early 1970s, with Pelé after having won the World Cup in 1970 in Mexico. Those are popular figures. So deeply authoritarian regimes and presidents became popular figures of their time. So we need to remember that and try to understand that as a way, I think, to make sense of what Bolsonaro represents in Brazil today. So let's go back to our lovely gentleman here. While I have just told you, right, I just mentioned that Brazil has had a very deep authoritarian sort of historical political trajectory, Bolsonaro represents something new. We have had a right-wing populism before in Brazil. We have had Vargas in some ways could be considered that, but we also had Carlos Lacerda in the 1950s and 60s, a strong sort of viable, seemed to be political right-wing populist. And then we, of course, Médici, the president I mentioned with Pelé before. Collor in the early 1990s represented a little bit of that sort of neo-populist, right-wing, neoliberal mixed with the populism of the 90s, similar to Fujimori at that time, as Kai mentioned before. But none of those represented really a serious threat, also as Kai mentioned, as Bolsonaro represents. Bolsonaro really is an heir of the of the dictatorship. He's a proponent of an overt authoritarian regime. And perhaps more puzzling than anything else, I would say, Bolsonaro is very popular and has become very popular, including among low socioeconomic segments of the Brazilian population, through sort of his mano dura policies, through proposing. One of the famous claims that he made and became very repeated among even lower income Brazilians was bandido bom é bandido morto, which means a good criminal is a dead criminal. So really proposing, harsh measures for public security, and really saying that a dictatorship in Brazil wasn't harsh enough. We should have done what Pinochet did. We should have done what the Argentines did, which was to kill way more people, to torture, to barbarize way more people, to privatize much further, similar to what Pinochet did. And he's now Minister of the Economy. Paulo Guedes is one of the sort of the Chicago boys, and, who praises the legacy of the neoliberal reforms in Chile. So Bolsonaro, in many ways, harkens back to a little bit of this right-wing populism legacy of Brazilian history, but he also represents something new. And hence, I think, it's interesting to, to think along the lines of this new phenomenon, global phenomenon of right-wing populism, such as the one represented by Trump. Bolsonaro has been called the tropical Trump. In which way would that be fair or not, of course, is what I think we should try to understand and think of it today. There are interesting similarities. I think both of them come to power. They claim to be anti-corruption while representing quintessentially corruption, being involved in deep corrupt deals and family deals. Interesting is the family connection there too. There's the Bolsonaro family as well as the Trump family as a family, besides the individual, right, involved in huge corruption deals and scandals. So they share that. I think perhaps Bolsonaro is a little more ideological, but still I would say that Bolsonaro in Congress as a member of the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil espoused very traditional nationalist military positions, including social programs and developmental sort of ownership of industries. But now, of course, he really put the hat of the neoliberal policies espoused by his finance minister. So he's wavered a lot in this ideology, and of course, Trump. It's hard to pinpoint what his ideology, and he also has reinvented himself during his political career a lot. So I would say there's no clear ideology. They're more there for the economic benefits of the position of being president. A very, very strong similarity would be the evangelical base, which was perhaps even more decisive, but also very important for the election of Trump. But in Brazil was one of the most decisive elements, I would say. That's what Andy here agrees or not later, in terms of electing Bolsonaro. Social media was extremely, extremely decisive in the election of perhaps also Trump, but certainly for Bolsonaro. And there's this app called WhatsApp. I don't know why it's not as popular here as it is in Brazil, but everybody in Brazil uses it, and it was one of the main ways to really share fake news about Fernando Haddad, the Labour Party candidate that went to the second round of the election in October, and really claiming outrageous things, such as that Haddad would kidnap the kids of the families and take them to sex-changing camps. So absurd claims, and that really escalated and was shared by millions of times among Brazilians, and really eroded any sort of possibility for Haddad to make his case, that was a lie, that was not impossible, and that was not true. I think the difference is that Bolsonaro has espoused a more militaristic, especially in the domestic context, agenda than Trump. He has been more overtly, even though Trump, of course, said that we should lock up Hillary. He has said, we need to kill more people, and I will erase the opposition in Brazil, and I'll make illegal the Labour Party during the campaign. So it was a little more overtly, claiming a harsh persecution and elimination, a physical elimination. He said in the second, prior to the second round of campaign, between the first and second round of campaign, that if you are in the opposition, your choices will be to leave the country or to die. So you'll be killed or you have to leave the country. Overtly be saying those things. And of course, I think an important difference is that in Brazil we have On the one hand, weaker institutional constraints such as media, judiciary, and maybe even legislative. Again, there's something to be debated later. But tied to it, you know, he has found, and the opposition to the Labour Party and the opposition that really was behind the impeachment of Dilma and now the arrest of Lula, who has been in prison now for almost a year, has found a lot of support between members of the judiciary and the public prosecutors, who had played a very important and decisive role. The guy, the judge who put Lula in prison, Sergio Moro, of course now is the Minister of Justice of Bolsonaro. To me, you know, really closing the loop of saying that, you know, he basically paved the way for Bolsonaro to get elected, and now he's being rewarded as the Minister of Justice, right? I mean, I know that's a sort of a little bit of perhaps a, you know, a strong claim, but I think you know, the facts are there and speak loudly for themselves. Now, of course, we are also here to not only to remind ourselves of the problems, but to see, you know, what are the prospects for resistance, right? As in the title of the presentation here today. I do think we have seen an institutional erosion in Brazil, such as the politicization of the judiciary, as a crisis of the political parties, a crisis of the political system as a whole. I think beyond institutional, you know, the formal weakening or challenges presented to the political parties, we have seen also an erosion of democratic values, democratic culture, such as, you know, overtly claiming to prosecute and to eliminate the opposition by killing them or sending them into exile, such as people taking to the streets demanding the impeachment of Dilma, saying that the Speaker of the House at the time, Eduardo Cunha, who now is in jail, but at the time was Speaker of the House, with signs saying, yes, he's a criminal, but he's on my side. You know, proudly claiming that, really, you know, proudly saying that we accept the corruption as long as it's not the corruption of the Labour Party. If it's a corruption of other parties, you know, it's fine. It's instrumental to our agenda. It's instrumental to doing things. So I think there's an important element of there which goes beyond sort of the overt functioning and legality and institutionality of political parties. We see here two gentlemen destroying a street name sign of Marielle Franco, a former councilwoman of the city of Rio, which was murdered in March last year. We still don't know, you know, the details of that murder. And in sort of in homage to her, right, they created this name, they renamed the name of the street that goes under the city hall in Rio, Marielle Franco Street. And these two gentlemen who were supporting Bolsonaro, one of them was elected, the one on the right was elected a member of the National Chamber of Congress in Brazil, destroying that sign and posting it on Facebook and posting it on social media and being praised by doing so. So I think that really speaks to this erosion of democratic values in the sense that the opposition, such as the landless workers movement, social movements as a whole, women's groups, gay groups, LGBT agenda, such as one represented by Marielle, Afro-descendants, native Brazilians, are all now seen as the enemy. And to treat with it, since they are seen as enemy, everything is game to oppose them and to destroy them and to eliminate them. And this has been said. Will this be implemented? To be seen, of course, I hope not, but it's to be seen. Maybe it was a little more of a rhetoric of an election, but the fact that this was voiced and repercuted and replicated and willingly and proudly spoken by millions of Brazilians, I think that is a very, very disturbing element. The cabinet of Bolsonaro really is a sort of the quintessential anti-cabinet. There's some echoes to Trump, I would say. You know, he put the fox to take care of every chicken coop. So the Minister of Environment doesn't believe in the Ministry of Environment. The Minister of Human Rights doesn't believe in the need for a Ministry of Human Rights. It's exactly that person that is in charge of taking care of that specific area. This is a debatable number. It came across a few minutes, a week ago or so, that, you know, the cabinet has been approved by 75% of Brazilians. I would debate that, but I would say that yes, the majority of Brazilians approves. I mean, not only in the election, but now, you know, pollings and sort of the perception we have is that despite what I call the cabinet of horror show or cabinet of horrors, it finds approval into large segments and large swaths of Brazilians, which in itself is of course also disheartening. So, what can be done? Where do we find resistance? Some people are counting on media. I would be a little skeptical. The media was really behind the very questionable impeachment proceedings of Dilma and really behind the also very questionable legal process that brought Lula to jail. But we'll see what that happens. Political parties also, the traditional ones, are supporting Bolsonaro now in Congress. Important ones that were said well, such as the PSDB, the former Cardoso president, President Cardoso's political party has declared full-fledged support to Bolsonaro in Congress. So I wouldn't count on them as well. The social movements, of course, now are being are weakened and are prosecuted and to be prosecuted more forcefully to be expected in the next few months and years. Artists, intellectuals, activists, people that really represented the opposition and the resistance during the dictatorship in the 60s and 70s, perhaps we should count on them, and they have many of them voice, and they, claiming with the elimination of the Ministry of Culture, which was really behind, cultural activities in Brazil. He eliminated. Bolsonaro said we don't need a Ministry of Culture, and that of course hits very hard among artists, actors, and activists and singers, and we'll see how they can do this. So to the traditional groups, it's hard to see much of a way out. I would say, therefore, that we really need to count on international solidarity. It's time to regroup. It's time to rethink. It's time to understand what happened. I think this panel really represents a possibility to also add in that conversation. In December 1st in New York, activists and academics throughout the United States joined together in creating what's called the National Network for Democracy in Brazil. You're more than welcome to look it up and see if you would be interested to know more about it and perhaps supporting that movement. And similar solidarity groups are being created in other parts of the world with connections with Brazilians in Brazil internally. But I say that may play an important role. The Washington Post last week made an editorial suggestion that the expansion of agriculture, agribusiness into the Amazon, the exports from those new areas that will be produced, and the exports produced in those new areas should be boycotted. And the international community could play also sort of an economic role in boycotting that production. Again, as Kai said before, the first week is not very, first week is terrible. The first week was a very powerful week in terms of what he really is trying to pursue what he said he would do. So he put unions. He eliminated the labor ministry, which was responsible for labor laws, labor rights, and union mobilization and representation in Brazil, in the hands of Sérgio Moro, who is an anti-labor, anti-union person and judge, and now will be having to give an approval of functioning, an ideological approval if unions are going to be allowed to function and to sustain. The final sentence. He abolished all LGBT legal protections that were in the books in Brazil. He transferred the supervision of indigenous lands from the agency of sort of the Bureau of Indigenous Affairs to the Agriculture Ministry, which again, which is represented and controlled by the oligarchs of the agribusiness in Brazil who want to expand the agricultural frontier into the Amazon, where most of the reservations are, which of course is a deep conflict of interest. So that is very, very also concerning and disturbing. And then beyond that, of course, we have witnessed a lot of violent acts against minorities, such as Afro-descendants, native Brazilians, women, LGBT groups, by Brazilians in general, by common Brazilians that claim to be affiliated with the government, of course, could not be punished in terms of, the government authorized them to act on their behalf, but that espouse this agenda and feel represented by Bolsonaro, but now feel entitled to act violently against people they don't agree with. So that in itself, I think, it represents a deeper erosion, a social, cultural erosion in Brazil that will take a long time to be reversed in my pessimistic view. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm very open to listen to different views, but I think that's where we also need to focus our attention and see what we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to Andy.
I'm going to stand because I'll need to point a little bit here at my slides. So to give you a sense of how important this Bolsonaro question is, this is totally unplanned, but not only do I have a very similar title to Rafael's, How Did We Get Here?, but I also have a very similar photo to Rafael's opening slide. And I am going to give a political scientist's eye to this question of how did we get here, meaning how did Brazil end up electing a man who has such far-right instincts, has said things that would seemingly rule him out for elective office over the years, that have been so threatening to such large groups of Brazilian society. How did we arrive at this place of electing someone of this ilk? From one perspective, I should begin by saying it's not entirely surprising, and this perspective is a comparative one. What I mean here is that Bolsonaro is part of a trend in the region that is moving rightward. Voters have, in recent years, elected more right-leaning politicians to the presidency, and that's the evidence that's shown up in this slide. Now, I'm not going to go into all the technical details, but each three-letter label that you see here is a single number that represents the ideological leaning of the electorate in a particular presidential election. Now, fortunately, Rafael provided all this wonderful, rich detail about what's been going on in Brazil over the course of the last 2 decades. I'm a political scientist. I take all that wonderful, rich detail and I reduce it to a single number. So that's oversimplifying, but you know, that's what we do. And what you'll notice is that, so the inputs to each of these numbers is simply 2 things. First of all, it's a measure of the ideological placement of each candidate's party, right? So the PT is left, and Bolsonaro is right, and Chavez is left, and so on and so forth. And so there's it's more sort of, it's more of gradation than just left or right, as you can see, but we measure each party along those lines. And then we simply weight those ideological placements by how well each candidate did in the election. So in an election where a left-wing candidate does very well, the country as a whole gets scored on the left. And in a country where a right-leaning candidate does really well, the country gets scored on the right. What you can see here with this red line is a central tendency of the entire Latin American region. And you'll notice that starting in the late 1990s and over the course of the first decade of the 2000s, this line trends leftward. This is the pink tide, or the left wave, that you're surely familiar with. But that has ended, as you can see. And countries throughout the region have been electing center, right of center, and as we know, right-wing candidates. So from that perspective, and you'll see here Brazil, the 4 elections in which the PT won all show up here, putting the country left of center, and then Brazil in 2018 is right there, a dramatic shift rightward. From that regional perspective, Brazil is just following a trend that is taking place around the entire hemisphere. But that's about the only perspective from which the election of Bolsonaro is not surprising. In fact, it really is surprising for a large number of reasons. First of all, historically, despite the traditional authoritarian instincts of some elements of Brazilian politics, as Rafael mentioned, at least since the turn to democracy in the mid-1980s, right and far-right parties and right and far-right candidates did not really gain much traction in presidential elections. Associating oneself with the military and with the authoritarian regime was not something that actually occurred by popular presidential candidates in Brazil since the 1980s. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was president for 8 years, was himself exiled by the military regime. And even though he governed on the center and center-right, he distanced himself and would surely never have said anything praiseworthy of authoritarianism. Perhaps the exception that proves a rule here is that Cardoso's vice president was a guy named Marco Maciel, who was affiliated with the military regime. But were we to poll Brazilians on who Cardoso's vice president was, most people would have never heard of the guy. They basically kept him hidden out of embarrassment for the fact that he was part of the military regime. And then, of course, the subsequent presidents from the PT were themselves exiled or tortured, persecuted by the regime. And so the open espousal, the open nostalgia for authoritarianism and the military dictatorship by Bolsonaro was genuinely new. And the fact that it did not hurt but actually maybe helped him win a presidential election is incredibly not only shocking but surprising. It's also shocking that Bolsonaro won because he came from a nothing party. He himself affiliated with the PSL, which in a very Orwellian way is the liberal social party. He himself affiliated with this party in 2017, just a year before the election. And in Brazil, the amount of television time that you get, basically the amount of time you get to put campaign commercials on the air, is a function of how big the party is, to make a very long and complicated story short. So Bolsonaro, because he was a member of a very small party, had virtually no television time, no campaign commercial time whatsoever. So that matters. It's also important to point out that he broke a PT, so the Labor Party of Lula and Rousseff, and a PSD, which is Cardoso's party. He broke their monopoly on presidential elections. Brazil has more parties than probably any country in the world. Right now, there's 30-odd parties with representation in the lower house. And yet, oddly, for reasons that political scientists don't have a good explanation for, just two of those parties, the PT and PSDB, really dominated presidential elections after democratization, with the exception of 1989, the first election. So the PSDB and the PT in the first round of each of these elections, as you can see, received anywhere between 70 to 80% of the entire vote. And Bolsonaro's party was a non-player in those elections. And then all of a sudden, in 2018, this monopoly ends, and a party which had never, ever actually been much to speak of, either in Congress or certainly in presidential elections, gets 46% of the vote, and then in the second round gets 55% of the vote and wins the election. And so this was shocking in the sense that someone from a tiny party that no one had heard of, and probably to this day most people still couldn't name Bolsonaro's party. You may have heard that one of his slogans is Meu partido é o Brasil, my party is Brazil, and you'll see his supporters wearing those t-shirts out and about all the time. Coming from a no-name party like that, he was still able to win the election. And then the final thing it's important to point out is that this victory was not inevitable. By some measures, Bolsonaro's victory on election day was not at all a foregone conclusion during the campaign. It wasn't as surprising as Trump's victory. But just to give you a sense here, I'll show you some quick polling data that shows simulated second-round elections. So during the course of the campaign, voters are asked, if the second round were between these two people, who would you vote for? And pollsters will pick various pairs of candidates to try and simulate what an eventual second-round election will be. And if you look at the series for the simulated second-round election between Bolsonaro and Haddad, who was the PT's eventual nominee, it looks like, early on, that Bolsonaro has a huge lead. But here's the catch. Up until September, Haddad wasn't even an actual candidate. Okay, very long story, but Lula was the PT's nominee. He was in prison, of course, and so plan B for the PT was to nominate Haddad. And so all this stuff that you see with Haddad behind, you should kind of ignore. Then it looks like here, up before the election in October, it looks as if Bolsonaro has a yawning lead, and that indeed was the case. But here's the catch. That line that I just added is the first round of the election. And as of the first round of the election, as you can see, Haddad, the PT candidate, had been making the run and looked as if he was going to be competitive in the second round. And to be quite honest, during these few weeks before the election, after Haddad had been declared the official nominee, but before the first round of the election, there were a lot of people, including, I must admit, myself, who thought that Bolsonaro was too extreme to win a second round election, that he was too extreme to get 50% of the vote, that all the rhetoric would catch up with him, and that he would lose. And you can see in the polls that it appeared to be pretty close between the two. And if you really look closely, within about 2 weeks before the election, that red line is the one on top. Haddad did have a lead in this simulated second round. But that all imploded, and obviously Bolsonaro won, and won handily in the second round by 10 points. So I just bring this up to say that another reason why this election was shocking is because it wasn't a foregone conclusion. Bolsonaro did have a commanding lead throughout the entire first round, but many people thought that he was too extreme to win in a race where he would need to get 50% of the vote. So why did it happen? Why did he win? First of all, I'll talk about what political scientists refer to as valence issues. A valence issue is a political issue that pretty much all voters agree on. Most voters agree that a good economy is a good thing, that less violence is better than more violence, and that clean government is better than corrupt government. And so elite contestation over valence issues is simply who can provide those things better than someone else. Valence issues here go a long way toward explaining, in particular, the rise of Bolsonaro. Corruption, as Rafael documented, it dominated news over the preceding 3-4 years. Lava Jato, many of you may be familiar with, is perhaps the largest corruption scandal that has been exposed in world history. And so voters, and it touched every single political party. There was no major traditional political party that was untainted by the Lava Jato investigations, including the PT. And so voters' disgust with traditional parties because of corruption was widespread. And let me also add that even though I would agree with Rafael that a lot of the evidence against Lula is driven by political and by his opponents and is very political. And of course, the impeachment itself was highly debatable and driven by political motives as well. For many voters, that doesn't matter. When I was in Brazil in the week before the election, I would talk to voters, many of them who weren't deeply aware of politics, weren't super knowledgeable. But the mere fact that Lula was in jail meant that he was corrupt. They couldn't quite recite the charges or understand the political nature to it, but it didn't matter. The guy was in jail, and so he and the PT were corrupt. And so that project by conservative forces in Brazil was effective not only because they put Lula in jail, but it also shaped perceptions of PT corruption. The economy wasn't great. And one of the hard and fast laws of political science is that incumbents and incumbent parties don't do well when the economy isn't doing well. Of course, the PT was no longer the incumbent party, but under Dilma, it experienced, by some measures, one of Brazil's worst recessions. By some measures, people call this Brazil's worst recession. It was certainly a very long recession, as you can see. And the economy had perked up by the time of the 2018 election, but nonetheless, under Dilma's watch, it had taken a downturn, and people still remembered that. And of course, violence, a major issue for Bolsonaro that he capitalized on, and Brazil just cannot get a handle on this tragedy. Homicide rates have increased, and he was able to give that a language and make that part of his campaign in a way that capitalized on voter fatigue with widespread violence. Positional issues. Positional issues are issues on which there is a cleavage in the electorate, on which voters disagree. Some voters like privatization, some don't. Some voters favor gay marriage rights, some do not. Of course, Bolsonaro also seemingly capitalized on a sense of unease, outrage, in the same way that Trump has, at changes in Brazilian society. Gay marriage became legal in Brazil in 2013, I believe, and many voters seemingly were favorable towards the hateful, violent, anti-gay, and also other kinds of rhetoric that attacked specific groups in Brazilian society. Much of this, again, I would repeat, is surprising. I mean, I certainly never believed that homophobia had disappeared from Brazil. But again, what is so surprising is the extent to which a candidate would use such gross and hateful rhetoric and seemingly be able to capitalize off of it instead of see it hurt him. So you hear discussions now that Brazil is engaged in a culture war. Supporters of Bolsonaro will complain about what they use the term cultural Marxism. They're in a war against cultural Marxism, which spreads from Brazilian universities and which is propagated by the PT and other forces of the left. Bolsonaro referred to leftism as a sickness during the campaign. And I don't yet have a sense, the research hasn't given us enough information to tell us the extent to which those values and attitudes are indeed shared by 55% of the electorate that voted for him. But it is clearly the case that there is a lot of those sentiments out there and that Bolsonaro was able to capitalize on them. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And now we will finish up with Consuelo.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be discussing today how efforts to protect democracy went through failures and successes in the case I know best, which is the historical case of the Chilean pro-democracy movement against the Pinochet dictatorship. I will also explain the similarities and differences between this historical case on what we can and what we're seeing today in the region, in particular in Venezuela. I end with some policy implications. Am I not close enough? Okay. Is this better? Great. The backsliding, 1 second, so I'll just do that. The backsliding of democracy in Latin America in the past few years has spurred considerable action from the political establishment, the general public, and even the international community. In Venezuela, we have seen leaders of a coalition of political parties of the opposition mobilize voters to the polls, boycott elections, call for monitors for elections domestically and internationally, march in the streets of Caracas, voice their opposition in newspapers, in the floor of the National Assembly, you name it, go to the Organization of American States, the United Nations, and voice opposition. Opposition political party leaders have sought exile, they have faced physical abuse, and gone to jail as well. They have sat for negotiations with intermediaries, such as the Pope. People have organized, millions of people have organized and taken to the streets to march and protest. They have also turned out in record numbers at the polls. They have also abstained from certain elections as a sign of protest. There are thousands of political prisoners, as Kai was mentioning, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Honduras today, and hundreds have already perished in this struggle. Countless resolutions and reports by the international community have also condemned these regimes, and especially because of their undermining of the democratic institutions, but also, in the case of Venezuela, especially engaging at the very highest levels in drug trade. So one of the questions that we have researched in political science and in the social sciences is how do these mass mobilization and mass movements develop from even small attempts and how they become large mobilizations that are sustained in through years and that are able to mobilize millions of people. But interestingly, the case of Latin America is really not about this puzzle. What we see in Latin America with democratic backsliding is not that there's a shortage of people on the streets, at least in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Honduras, as we've seen recently. The political elite and the masses are not standing by idle, and it's not, at least we can say that Latin Americans don't think that their institutions will protect them from the executive overreach in the way that, for example, Tim Snyder would argue that Americans might do with Trump, just sit and wait until the institutions protect us. But if there's anything that the Venezuelan case at least shows, is that it's not enough to have numbers on the streets for success. So there are two main challenges for the opposition in Venezuela, and I would also argue Nicaragua and Honduras today. And the main one is that they haven't been able to elicit defections, as many as are needed, especially from the military, from the bureaucracy, from the Supreme Court, and from the police. And also, I would argue that managing repression is also another challenge that Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Honduras face. Though I would argue that the repression against Venezuelan pro-democracy movement has not been so severe as to stifle them. More recently, it has become much more of a difficulty, and we have seen the same with Nicaragua and Honduras. So civil resistance campaigns that achieve regime change are generally large and diverse, and they ultimately achieve success when security forces and the bureaucracy are unwilling to follow orders from the regime in power. In my research, I have shown that very high levels of collective violence and selective violence are incompatible with successful mass mobilization. So what can the successful resistance of the authoritarian regime in Chile teach us about pro-democracy efforts today? There are three major findings from my research in Chile that I would like to share with you today. The first one is that when considering the part of the opposition that the regime wants to eliminate, such as was the case for ultra-leftists and leftists in Chile, I find that those dissidents must organize underground. And their survival is far more likely when they do so organize in clandestinity and adopt a compartmentalized organizational structure. And when their militants have the skills to adopt that. And this picture shows what I mean by a compartmentalized organizational structure. So militants in one cell, so for example, on the left, would not know the people on the right. So if the repressive apparatus catches one of these dissidents, they are not going to be able to easily take out the whole organization. I studied this question by cross-checking two lists, the kill list of the Pinochet dictatorship that I found in the archives, and also the list of the victimized that the Chilean Truth Commissions were able to put out. And so really comparing the intended to repress population with those who were actually victimized was very fruitful because it revealed the surprising result that groups that the government wanted to destroy were actually being able to curb repression that was intended toward them. And so I argue that the difference was this compartmentalization, this organizational form. That said, there's a major downside to this underground organizing and compartmentalization. Though activists operating in clandestinity in Chile were able to continue their political education campaigns and political awareness for their followers, they were ill-equipped to wage mass mobilization when it was time to do so, when repression really went down, because of this disconnected nature of the organization, right? The second finding that I wanted to highlight has to do with managing repression of nonviolent public organizations. There were certain organizations in Chile, such as those led by the families of the disappeared, that were able to organize publicly and nonviolently at a time when repression was extremely high and everyone was fearful. There was basically no space in civil society. These groups were not only able to open civil society space, but they also grew in size, and also their models spread across the country. So it was, for me, very surprising to see this at a time when repression was extremely high. I argue that they were able to do so thanks to protector institutions. In this case, the protector institution was the local Catholic priests that were aligned with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Santiago, who generally supported human rights and provided some safeguards to the opposition. These Catholic priests were able to lower the cost of mobilization because the Pinochet dictatorship needed the Catholic Church for legitimacy. So I tested this proposition about protector institutions by geocoding the pro-human rights congregations and the pro-Pinochet congregations, as well as the location of the mobilization by the families of the disappeared. Mapping these congregations and the locality of the resistance, I was able to show that the Catholic priests helped the opposition when they were pro-human rights, and actually the priests that were pro-Pinochet really undermined mobilization because they had very local information about the resistance and they were able to provide it to the government security forces. This is just a map of the type of geocoding that I did to code the congregations and the repression. The third finding from the case of Chile has to do with how a mass mobilization effectively consolidated. The argument I make about successful mass mobilization is that it's a process of alliance formation and the consolidation of hundreds or even thousands of organizations and interest groups. So the logic of alliance formation between nonviolent opposition groups is based on, I argue, recruiting ever larger numbers of people by joining other groups, but at the same time managing levels of repression so that they don't go above a certain level that makes public organizing very difficult. And these figures are basically from a data set that I created from opposition groups in Chile and the ties that they had between each other. And I basically this is briefly to show you that at a time in 1973 when Pinochet comes into power, repression is extremely high. There's almost no ties between these opposition groups. And there's a massive amount of ties by 1983, which is at the start of the mass mobilization where millions of people went to the streets. This means that as repression decreases, we should observe a drastic increase in the number of alliances and civil society organizations. And this is what these two graphs show. The one on your left shows a decline in both legal and violent repression, and the one on the right shows a drastic increase in the number of alliances between opposition groups from the same data set. The main exception, though, to this logic is actually, interestingly, political parties. I would argue that opposition political parties tend to join alliances with a minimum winning coalition logic. This means that political parties are far less likely to build unity and are more likely to exclude certain actors that are strategic for their competition. Therefore, when political parties are the primary drivers of regime change movement, the process of diversification of the movement may be impeded for those reasons. The movement is more likely to become diverse and large in numbers when political parties join in the latter stages of the movement or when they're actually capable of uniting, as was the case very late stages of the pro-democracy movement in Chile when they joined forces against Pinochet. That said, political parties have a unique capability to convene large numbers of people, and in some countries, it's basically the only source to do mass mobilization because there's a very weak civil society. Now, what are the lessons for Venezuela? There are three main important differences between the case of Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship and today's Venezuela. Unfortunately, there are factors that make generally democratic transitions more difficult for Venezuela. The first is the government's involvement in illicit activities and drug trafficking. The second is the geopolitical support of illiberal countries like Russia and China. And the third is a comparatively weak history of civil society in the country. The Venezuelan state, which relies on oil revenues for about 50% of its budget, has faced severe difficulties given the historically low prices of oil since 2015. And Maduro, however, has partly compensated this shortage in funds by basically taking into the drug trade and illicit trafficking. Importantly, these rents have allowed the government to buy off key members of the military in various ways. In addition, oil and drug money largely shield the government from domestic pressures, making it difficult for people to directly impose costs on the government. The international community may have a more prominent role to play by restricting the movement of politicians engaged in illicit activities and by imposing other types of targeted sanctions. Of course, these efforts by the international community are undermined by states like Russia and China, which cushion the effect of sanctions. Illiberal allies are a counterweight to pressure that the international community may impose for human rights violations and thereby strengthening these authoritarian governments. In addition, civil society organizations in Venezuela have only recently begun to build their capacity independent of political parties, largely as a response of the deterioration of democracy. The construction of civil society, however, is very slow, and it will take a long time to build, trade unions and independent neighborhood associations, professional organizations, and the like. The one exception, I would say, in Venezuela is that there is a strong student movement apart from the political parties. So what Venezuelans can most learn from Chile is how the political parties from the left and the center, actually center-right, joined together to put forth one candidate to go against Pinochet in the 1989 referendum. The political parties that joined together in Chile were actually bitter enemies prior to their fruitful negotiations in the mid-'80s. So it is not impossible for Venezuelan politicians to do the same. They haven't been really bitter enemies in the way that they were in Chile. Venezuelan opposition parties, though, have yet to show the leadership and the foresight to actually put democracy and country over their self-interest so far. The unification of the political opposition and the growth of the civil society sector will yield a diversification of the movement, which is key, and it would make, importantly, defections more likely. Already, we're seeing signs of tensions within the Maduro regime and the military. The opposition has to make every effort to forge these ties with those on the fence, with those who are not so ardent in favor of Maduro, and particularly with military personnel, low-ranking and high-ranking, and with bureaucrats in the judiciary and the Interior Ministry. And lastly, what can we do? For the top targets of the regime, I would say that my research implies that it's best to go into hiding, to seek exile, or to go underground in compartmentalized cells if they have the skills to do so. For other domestic activists, my research suggests that seeking protection from third-party agents improves their chances of avoiding victimization. These third-party agents, however, have to be ones generally that provide legitimacy to the government. So local activists would be best equipped to actually determine who those people might be in their particular context. Activists should focus on broadening their base, on pressuring political parties and their own organizations to build alliances, and on doing as much outreach as possible to low ranks of the bureaucracy and to the military. For international actors interested in democracy promotion and human rights, my research suggests that when repression is extremely high, the international community should focus on providing resources to local organizations that are providing humanitarian assistance, especially when those organizations are allowed to operate by the regime. So those are maybe more moderate than what we would like, but it's actually pretty effective, I would argue. The international community could also help the most vulnerable to seek exile. The diaspora can remain active from abroad and return home when the time is ripe. This really happened in Chile. International actors could also focus on supporting independent civil society organizations, even narrow and apolitical ones that we wouldn't associate with a pro-democracy movement. This is especially the case during periods of high repression. So for example, I'm thinking of think tanks funded by the Europeans. They were really helpful in Chile for many members of the opposition. Why? Because these institutions allowed intellectuals, teachers, professors, lawyers, journalists to remain in the country, to have a living wage, and to be able to remain active in the resistance and just do the everyday acts of resistance that are so key. Venezuela is suffering from a staggering human capital flight that is only hurting its prospects for democracy in the future. And finally, when repression is reduced or becomes narrower, international actors should focus strongly on facilitating alliance formation among civil society organizations and especially opposition political parties. So providing the incentives for those political parties to align is really critical. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Consuelo. So I'm going to hold off on any other remarks, and we will just open up for a question and answer period.
Well, thank you so much. I really am thankful to the whole panel and to the organizers because we learned a lot, obviously. And there are complementarities in what was presented by each member of the group. Let me ask a question that perhaps is not so much conjunctural, which is, of course, important in politics especially, but really more theoretical, conceptual. There is a concept that was first introduced by Michał Kalecki, the famous Polish socialist economist and political economist, and it's the concept of intermediate class. One of the problems, you find it all over the world, is that because of the complexities of class articulation in so-called developing countries, you have many, many layers of classes. And so in Brazil, in Venezuela, what are those, and how complicated do they make the movement from the left or left-center coalition? And let me just add a rider, because I have worked in the underground and I know about these kind of organizational concepts and coalition building. And it's very useful, so thank you for having done that. I hope activists especially will take note of it. But one problem that I think becomes salient in terms of democracy is actually two problems. So let me just make it two. One is that when you're building coalitions, you need to be aware of who are you in bed with. Because if I am going to, as a leftist, have coalition strategically with neoliberals who will then dominate, and you don't need to be an expert in international relations to know that the history of American support, especially for so-called democratic movements, is not really a very honorable one. On the other hand, politics does make strange bedfellows, so that's okay. The second problem is the one that you touched upon, but I think we need to elaborate on, which is these underground structures. How can they actually cut against the strategic aim of democracy from below and building democratic institutions? Thank you.
Should I respond or?
Yeah,
okay.
you can go for it.
Great, thank you so much for your comment and question. So, on the building coalitions and who are you in debt with? You said debt, right? Yeah. In bed with. Yeah. So, well, both works. I would say that yes. I mean, in the case of Chile, people had a lot of difficulty. The Communist Party joining the Christian Democrats that supported the coup. I mean, the coup that almost destroyed the Communist Party was aligning with the Christian Democrats for this negotiation. I guess it got to the point where it became so clear that no matter who gets elected, no Pinochet is better than not. And so I guess the Communist Party did not suffer so much except for, as a consequence of joining the Christian Democrats, except for they did have a break-off from the most radical group, or flank, but this was more the armed and the more radical part of the Communist Party, and they broke off from there. So there was a break-off. There was some cost that the political party faced, but I think overall they really benefited from uniting, because they not only defeated Pinochet in the election, but they also were able to. The Communist Party is still alive today, well and good. So. Briefly on your second one, yeah, so usually underground capabilities and compartmentalization is associated with not a pro-democracy movement like an open mass mobilization at all. And it's actually associated very heavily with armed resistance, because it's actually what guerrilla warfare generally adopts, or terrorist networks and things like that. But I would argue that for a period of time when repression is extremely high, I would say that there's nothing wrong with, or I've observed nonviolent groups that aim to do pro-democracy work just adopt these strategies for a period of time. It does have a cost, as I mentioned, that they won't be able to very easily transform, but it will allow them to survive. And so I only exclusively say that this is probably a good idea for people who are top targets, like you're going to be assassinated if you don't adopt these strategies. But point well taken.
Andy and Rafael, do you want to talk about classic? Sure. Try. So that's a great topic. We should have a whole panel on that at some point. What's up with the Latin American middle classes, right? They went from the 1950s, a period I studied most closely, from sort of being the hope for democratization and development in Latin America to in the early 60s in Brazil for once, and then throughout the region, I would say, to supporting repressive regimes against, popular measures and popular enfranchisement and popular inclusion. I think we have just witnessed that once again. I was mentioning here with a colleague of ours from Brazil who is a visiting professor here today, Marco Sepique, who is sitting here in the front row, and I encourage everyone to come later and look him up and meet him about this process in Brazil. Dilma actually appealed more to the middle classes than Lula. Lula had way more appeal to the lower segments of Brazilians, lower socioeconomic segments of Brazilians, and policies that really changed their lives. And Dilma had a much more traditional conservative middle class, moral appeal agenda, despite some specific exceptions, some sort of more identity issues. But as a whole, in the economic front, it was a much more sort of traditional middle class government, and it was exactly among the middle class that she lost support and really brought her to her doom. So I agree. The middle classes, middle sectors, middle social income sectors, is not one single one. That's an important statement, as you said, to try to understand the situation, but also so I think it deserves a much more attention to understand what is up with the policies that they are inclined to support and not, and how they so quickly change allegiances and are willing to support such a radical right-wing candidate such as Bolsonaro. Of course, the Bolsonaro case is even more problematic because he also found appeal among lower social economic groups in Brazil, but predominantly in the beginnings, and brought him to a sort of becoming a candidate that was willing to venture into a campaign among the middle classes, which played decisive with this sort of anti-popular agenda. So how do we understand this? Should we continue to be counting on this? I mean, one of the big questions that the left has been asking itself, I think, in Latin America and other parts of the world, but in Brazil more recently, is how do we gain back the lower socioeconomic agenda or popular labor demands and needs? Should we continue to try to focus on the middle classes or not? I mean, how do we balance those two things? Are they balanced? That's not a word, but are they? Can we balance them both? Can we push for them together? I certainly don't have the answer, but I think we have to really think about those things. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it by describing classes as multi-layered and just incredibly difficult to characterize. It remains the case that on average, poor people in Brazil were more likely to vote for the left, for Haddad, for the PT, than were middle and upper class people. And that relationship still held, just as it held in the preceding 3 elections in Brazil.
But geographically uneven, right?
Well, yeah, the Northeast is definitely the only region that Haddad won states in is the Northeast in Brazil, which is the poorest region. But yet many poor people nonetheless voted for Bolsonaro, and it just indicates how complicated their values and interests are. Many of them are more subject to violence. I mean, unequivocally, poor are more subject to the day-to-day violence that had been escalating over the preceding 8 years. It is important to point out that violence actually peaked in Brazil in the late 1990s and early 00s, and so there was progress relative to that time period under Lula. But as you saw from the slide I showed, after 08, 07, it had been gradually increasing, and so poor people perhaps saw, some poor people perhaps saw in Bolsonaro an attempt to combat escalating violence. Poor people are more likely to be evangelical in Brazil, and some of that rhetoric and language and identity politics maybe appealed to them as well. So that's not really an answer. It's a way of saying it's really complicated and hard to put one's finger on, but it's more than just strictly economic interests.
So if there are a number of questions, we'll take a few now and then come back to the panel for the end. So we'll start over there and then come on over.
Thanks. Great panel and great job putting this together. Kai put it together. He really deserves the credit, and I'm very appreciative. It's a great group that you pulled here. So one of the observations that I wanted to make, and I don't know if which of the panelists would respond or at all, and that is there a difference in struggles for democracy in leftist governments that have backslid versus rightist governments that have backslid? And there are certainly similarities in that both kinds of governments backslide in some similar ways. They undermine existing institutions and constitutions. They attack civil society. And so there are similarities in the way in which they backslide on democracy. But there are also differences, and in particular, and as I think about international solidarity, international action, when the right undermines civil society, they want no civil society at all. Their approach tends to be to really try to disarticulate unions and social movements and other organizations in civil society because, as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no society. We are just individuals. And that's the way in which the right sees the world and would like the world to operate. It's convenient for them. For the left, when they go after existing civil society, what they tend to do is seek a mobilizational civil society. In other words, they try to capture all unions and all parties and all social movements and turn them into the vehicles and the transmission belts of their program. And that also has an undermining effect on democracy, but it's a very different sort of scenario, and it does have implications, I think, for what democratic support and international solidarity might look like. International solidarity, where there are right-wing regimes like Pinochet, can support civil society that is being attacked, that has been attempted to be eliminated. In left-wing contexts, and here, I wonder if Cuba is something that we might look at. Cuba's had a dictatorship for 60 years now, and in part it's because attempts by the U.S. and other actors to intervene and to create a civil society fit into the narrative that exactly that leftist regime can point to and say, this is why we need to mobilize even more our control over civil society. And so the kinds of interventions that the international community can make in right and left-wing backslid contexts are different. And so I'm curious, now we're looking at the current moment and the way in which this is happening across the region, but we have some differences in terms of left and right wing contexts, and so I'd be curious to think about that a little bit. Anyway, Kai. Oh, there's another microphone there. Great.
Mine is a question. We have a partnership with an individual in Nicaragua right now who we have been sending money to through our nonprofit for the past few years, and that goes to supplemental food at the school that we sponsor and also educational supplies. We've been able to visit even this past year, but now that's changed where he's been placed on a blacklist by his government, so that prevents him from being able to continue to work with us, and because of the work that he does. So we're very small. It's just my husband and I and like our family who work in this nonprofit as we are building it. But how do we continue the relationship to make sure that he still is able to receive the funds so that the school continues to be operational? Because now it's about 50 students and they rely on a lot of the food that they get throughout the week from the school. But as we start this year to send our next quarter amount to him, we don't know exactly how we could continue that relationship. He's spoken about maybe wanting to leave Nicaragua to come here, but advice.
I'm going to throw right quickly on that because they'll say we have a Nicaraguan citizen and activist. Yeah. She would be extremely helpful in advising you among some of the
Wondering in Costa Rica that a similar situation with the election 6 months ago in Costa Rica versus Brazil, and how Costa Rica was able to resist the potential right, as opposed to other countries have succumbed.
One last question, and then we'll bring it back.
Hi, my name is David. Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, I didn't hear discussions of race in your talk, so I was wondering if you can talk about that. What does the role of race plays in this shifts between repression and the fight towards the democratization of, let's say, Brazil or Nicaragua or Venezuela?
Go for it.
Who wants to start?
It's a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Gee, okay. Again, thank you for the comments and questions. As usual, Aaron is very insightful. Interesting point. I tend to completely agree, as I usually also do, to his views. That I think the resistance shall be different depending on the regime. I can really, see that, and that's why we see so many echoes between today Brazil and especially the more recent dictatorship, in the sense that it creates mobilizations which speak to a collectivist framing of things, right? So we talk about networks and we talk about solidarity from the outside, such as the network in support of Brazilian democracy, as I mentioned before, that was created here in December 1st. And even the critique of the government is destroying policies for specific groups, for indigenous groups, for Afro-Brazilians. So the resistance, yes, it will be framed along the lines of a neoliberal authoritarian regime that claims that seeks to destroy social policies and an entire sort of conversation about a national project and who the country is, which is framed along lines of groups and collectives. So to resist the case of Venezuela, which is arguably one of the most complicated today in Latin America, I think it has to be different, and I perhaps would only talk a little bit about Nicaragua, and knowing that many other Nicaraguan experts here much better than I. That has been one of the challenges in the case of Nicaragua. I think in Nicaragua, 6 months, a year ago, the resistance was in a better shape than today, because the regime was able to repress so well, saying, well, that's the attack from the right, that's the individuals destroying our entire Sandinista project here, which of course has been entirely co-opted by other ideas and everything. So I do think it is a different thing, and that poses challenges for how we should conceive these different groups and things. Race in the conversation, of course, is not an easy one, in the sense to how do we position it here. I think the Bolsonaro phenomenon also puts new challenges into that conversation. One of the puzzling things about Bolsonaro was that he found support among women, and he found support also among Afro-Brazilians, while being overtly anti-women and Afro-Brazilians and indigenous Brazilians, right? But he also finds some appeal there. Is it among the majority of them? I don't think so. I think women took to the streets in millions to protest Bolsonaro. Afro-Brazilian mobilization has really been strong vocally against him, but nonetheless, Afro-Brazilians and Brazilian women in numbers voted for him. So that it sort of is a new element to sort of our ideas, how we frame in the conversation about race and politics in Brazil. So maybe the evangelical factor is, as long as with the urban violence factors, I think those are the two important ones that we have to bring to understand why Brazilian women and Afro-Brazilians, at least in some portions, have voted for Bolsonaro. So what I would say is that the discussion about race in Brazil has become a little more complicated, if it was not already enough complicated. So join the conversation.
Yeah, I think, Aaron, you surely answered your own question far better than I could. I would just, to maybe inject a little bit of optimism into the conversation, I would be skeptical of the extent to which Bolsonaro will be able to shut down Brazil's civil society. I am optimistic that Brazil has a very vibrant civil society. As Rafael said, there was the Ele Now protests, that not him, #NotHim protests that took place, that were organized by feminists, that were organized by women in the lead up to the election. Brazil still has a very vibrant progressive Catholic church. It's not a huge share of the labor market, but it still has left-leaning unions, and it's too overwhelming, and it would be too costly for Bolsonaro to shut that down. There will certainly be rhetorical attacks and various forms of policy attacks against left-leaning civil society, but I don't think that's going to go away, and I think that will be a major focus of resistance for the next few years.
Just briefly, I also want to echo that Aaron's question was brilliant and thought that that's really a lot of food for thought. And so I don't have a clear answer, just to say that I will say that there are, I think the main issues that the right and the left use to justify degrading democracy are different. So in the right, we've seen very much like identity politics, and in the left, a lot of it has been U.S. intervention, for example. So I think the opposition really needs to pay attention to that. But I really find this interesting idea, this idea interesting of the mobilization being captured rather than destroyed. So I'll think a lot more about that. Thank you. And on race, I would say that when I talked about the diversification of the movement, this is one of the things I mainly want to focus on in Venezuela, is that the political parties and the students and the other activists that are trying to organize and build alliances, they're not really reaching out to the people who tend to be darker and poorer in the shanty towns of Venezuela. So, yeah, definitely plays a big role.
We'll take one last question. We're running slightly over time, but
Oh,
yeah,
I
don't really know about Costa Rica.
I just say go Ticos. That's what
Hi. Hello, thank you, everyone. You were mentioning that the Pinochet regime sought, and through its association with the Catholic Church, sought legitimization, and the Catholic Church itself became a protective institution for the Chilean Resistance Coalition. This brings me to two questions. The first one, what are those protection institutions in Venezuela, and if they've had an actual impact on what's going on right now? And what happens in Brazil when the rhetoric doesn't seem to care for any type of legitimization? That's kind of what this whole, all these lectures or all these, tie together, I think, for me.
Are you going to ask more, or should I?
I think
Okay,
we're
great. I'll
running
just
short.
quickly
so,
say,
yeah.
that's a really big question. What is a protector institution in Venezuela? I think that activists are locally are most equipped to say that. I will say that from my observations, I think that there have been, I think that the most kind of the strategic positioning would be a type of group that is based on, kind of low income people who are organizing civil society, like an organization around a church or a education, something like that, that starts offering protection to the big protests, for example. I think that would be helpful because Maduro really relies on kind of having the poor people on his side, and so I think it's if they can find organizations that are kind of composed and led by lower income folk, but that are also pro-human rights and trying to get some level of democracy in the country, I think that would be very strategic. But it's hard to say exactly which organization that would be for me from here.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the question in Brazil.
What happens in Brazil where the rhetoric doesn't seem to care for any type of external
Sure. No, I think that's a great challenge. So I did a piece, one of those op-ed pieces, right after UN Human Rights Agency declared that the trial of Lula was not fair and he shouldn't be in prison. My piece, what said was that we missed the good old times when the Brazilian ruling elites were concerned about the image that Brazil had in the world, right? Because they don't care. Certainly they did not care when the agency made that statement, and that seems to be the case now. I mean, our new foreign minister. There's not enough to say about him, but one of the many interesting claims he did in the last 10 days is that Brazil has to align with itself, which is of course absurd for a diplomat to say, has to finalize within itself, which is basically saying, yes, we know there will be protests coming from the outside, but that's our agenda, and we'll go for it. Of course, the question is, how long can they sustain that, Right? That's why I said I think one of the ways will be to hit where where it hurts. If we are able, I think it's very challenging. But if we're able to really organize some sort of to the more outrageous cases, such as massacre against indigenous groups, massive deforestation in the Amazon, and products being shipped out, being exported from those regions, and we could amass some sort of movement to boycott those things. That would quickly, right, produce some sort of pain into powerful groups in Brazil. The agribusiness sector, one of the most powerful economic groups in Brazil, that would try to reverse some of the course. That has happened before. I mean, the dictatorship, which started with a very sort of a neoliberal avant la lettre discourse right in the early 60s, quickly came to realize that, well, we actually have to revive some of the developmentalist policies of the 50s as a way to make it viable, our rule here in Brazil. So it has happened before. Timing and the pain along the way, of course, is what I'm mostly concerned in a sense, because, yes, people are already being killed and already being massacred as we speak. And hence, my request here that please let's pay attention to what's going on, and let's be aware of the possibilities of organization and to voice what's happening and to organize some sort of concerted resistance and to publicize and to denounce and to not only in Brazil, of course, in Nicaragua and elsewhere, what's happening in Latin America. This is a challenging, once again, a wave of challenging times that the region is facing, many countries in the region are facing, right? So there's some interesting things happening in Mexico, just to counterpoint a little bit, but in many countries of the region facing challenging times, and our interest and our eye to the region and our attention and being aware of what's going on, it's the first step. So I don't know if you want to add something.
All right, thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you to all our panelists for this great discussion, and I hope that these conversations will continue on. So thank you very much.